Welcome to Mysterious Clues, where we uncover hidden truths and unsolved mysteries from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. The villa stood like a sleeping beast at the edge of Lake Geneva, part museum, part mausoleum. The residence of Maximilien de Vries had long been an object of fascination for collectors and connoisseurs, and for good reason. Few in Europe possessed the sheer breadth and obsession of the man's antiquities collection, nor the secretive precision with which he curated it. He rarely entertained, he never loaned, and to be invited to his estate, the collector's shadow, as it was mockingly called by his more cynical rivals, was to be admitted into a sanctum of secrets. It was precisely such an invitation that Inspector Gaston Leclerc of the Swiss police now stared at grimly, folded neatly beside the body. Maximilien de Vries was dead. The library was immaculate, despite the chaos of the moment. It had the cool, unlived-in hush of a place preserved more for worship than comfort. Mahogany shelves stretched to the vaulted ceiling. Spotlights glinted off the glass cases that imprisoned ancient coins, Greek funerary masks, Roman scroll fragments, and one large, suspiciously unobtrusive wooden crate, marked only in faded Sumerian. Glyphs. The collector himself, once grand, now crumpled, lay across the carpet, his arm outstretched toward a toppled goblet of red wine. At first glance, it could have been a tragic stroke. At second glance, it wasn't. The shattered stem of the goblet was found not under the body, but beside the fireplace. The fatal contents, laced with strychnine, a physician had already suggested, had left no smell, no stain, and very few clues. The guests had been few, and yet all were very present enough to appear as stunned as they were wary. Gaston Leclerc was no fool. He had handled delicate cases before. But the more he listened to the clumsy statements of the guests, so carefully phrased, so artfully paced, the more uneasy he grew. There were 5 of them, all now seated in the very room where their host had died the night before. Lady Helena Marsh of London society, elegant, imperious, and rumoured to be de Vries's on-again, off-again confidant. Edward Langford, a reclusive manuscript scholar, with a stammer and a habit of refusing to make eye contact. Solange Petit, de Vries' personal curator, French-born and sharp-tongued, known for her immaculate memory and temperamental loyalty. Tomás Lucero, an Argentinian gem appraiser and alleged smuggler, whose invitation had surprised even himself. And lastly, curiously, Adriana de Vries, Maximilien's estranged niece, now returned from America after nearly 2 decades of silence. Her inheritance would be considerable, her alibi vague, a death by poison in a locked library, a room where every object could be worth a fortune, or a motive. But Leclerc knew his own limits. He had called for help the moment he saw the glass. That help had just arrived, disembarking from a hired motor launch at the villa's small pier. A compact man in a pale grey suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his hat tilted just so. His moustache, a magnificent feat of grooming, twitched as he surveyed the house. Hercule Poirot, world-famous detective, climbed the steps with delicacy and a touch of theatrical flair. Leclerc met him at the threshold, clearly relieved. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "we have une situation rather delicate." Poirot removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. "Mon ami," he said, "if it were not delicate, you would not have called me." He cast a single glance past the inspector's shoulder, taking, in the sombre faces, the velvet ropes along the cases, the faint outline of the fallen body already covered by a linen sheet. "Poison?" Poirot asked mildly. Leclerc nodded. "Yes, we believe strychnine." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A theatrical choice." He stepped carefully into the room, his eyes flitting from guest to guest, never pausing long, never lingering rudely, but absorbing, always absorbing. Lady Helena flicked her cigarette ash into a priceless Grecian urn and gave him a smile too tight to be genuine. Edward Langford stood at the edge of the carpet, staring at his shoes. Solange clutched a leather-bound inventory book, as if it were scripture. Lucero adjusted his cufflinks with exaggerated calm, and Adriana, tall, composed, unreadable, sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap as if awaiting judgment. Poirot turned to Leclerc. "Mon ami," he said softly. "You are quite right. This is delicate. And so, let us not disturb too much, eh? The truth is like a vase. It must be lifted with care," he paused. "Let us begin with observation and then interrogation." The guests looked at one another. The air grew taut. A collector was dead. His treasures remained. But one of them, one very human, very living one, had taken something far more precious than any ancient coin, and Hercule Poirot had just begun to sharpen his little grey cells. Poirot stood just inside the threshold of the Grand Library, his gaze drifting from one guest to the next, with the subtlety of a painter choosing which stroke would define the portrait. Each face offered its own stillness, its own careful neutrality, but it was the kind of stillness that prickled, not soothed. Even silence, when studied closely, had a posture, and to Hercule Poirot, the posture of silence could speak volumes. Inspector. Leclerc made to open his notebook again, but Poirot lifted a hand, gently, firmly. "No, my friend," he said. "Let us not rush. The room, she still breathes with what happened last night. Allow me to listen." He moved through the library with light, deliberate steps, pausing beside the velvet ropes that guarded a Babylonian clay tablet. Then beside, an open glass case containing a missing scroll, absent now, perhaps removed for study or theft. Poirot didn't touch a thing. His hands, gloved once more, remained behind his back, but his eyes catalogued everything. At last, he turned to the assembled group. "You will forgive me," he said with polite gravity, "but before I ask questions, I must know who you are. Not your names, no, those are simple. I wish to know who you are in relation to the late Monsieur de Vries. How did you come to be here? What were you to him, and he to you?" The guests glanced at one another, wary. Then Lady Helena Marsh, regal in a deep burgundy dress that gave her the air of mourning even before the death, stood and walked to the center of the room. "I'll begin," she said, not as if volunteering, but as if claiming the role she believed was hers by right. "I've known Maximilian for nearly 20 years. He and I were close companions at times. At other times we didn't speak for months. He was a man of moods, and I respected them." Her voice was even, controlled. "We shared a passion for antiquities. I donated several pieces to his collection, and on occasion I curated for him. I arrived 3 days ago by his invitation." Poirot inclined his head. "Merci, madame." "And did you observe anything unusual in his manner? Fatigue, perhaps? A change in routine?" Lady Helena's lip twitched. "Maximilian was always eccentric. But no, nothing that struck me. He was pleased, even animated. He said he had acquired something rare." Poirot said nothing but noted the phrase. Edward Langford stepped forward next, his eyes darting toward the floor and then toward Poirot's immaculate shoes. He rubbed his hands together nervously. I was here at Max's request to authenticate a pair of Phoenician tablets. I'm a manuscript scholar, you see. Cambridge. Well, formally." He coughed. "He'd been corresponding with me for weeks, asked me to come quietly. I arrived 2 nights ago." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And did you see these tablets?" Langford blinked. "No, he kept them in the basement archive. Said he wanted to reveal them once the others had left. I thought that odd." Poirot smiled gently. "Monsieur de Vries, he liked his drama, yes?" Langford gave a weak laugh. "Yes, very." Now it was Solange Petit's turn. She remained seated, but straightened with rigid posture. "I have been with Monsieur de Vries for nearly 12 years. I managed every inventory. I handled his correspondence. I am the reason his collection has not collapsed into chaos." Poirot nodded. "You were also here last night?" "Oui," she said tightly. "I served the wine myself, from the cellar. Stock, as always. Max insisted on that particular bottle, Chateau Pavie 2001, a favorite of his." "And did anyone else pour a glass?" Her lips thinned. He poured the rest. "But only after I opened it. I know my work, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot made a mental note of the defensiveness. It was not uncommon in those who managed order in a world prone to unraveling. Tomás Lucero had been standing at the back, hands in his pockets, head tilted. Now he stepped forward with a lazy grace. "I was the last to be invited. Only met De Vries once before in Buenos Aires. He admired a necklace I appraised, and when we spoke again, he asked me to visit. His accent, warm and musical, slid around his words. I didn't expect to be in Switzerland this month, but who says no to De Vries? Poirot regarded him. And did he speak to you of what he recently acquired? Lucero nodded. He hinted, said it would put all his other treasures in the shadows, but he wouldn't say what it was. Curious, Poirot murmured. Finally, Adriana de Vries stood. She had said nothing until now, her silence heavy with withheld emotion. She was in her early 30s, with dark eyes that had already seen disappointment. Her tone was measured, neither warm nor cold. I'm his niece, his only living relative to my knowledge. My mother was his sister. She paused. We hadn't spoken in almost 19 years. He cut off all contact after a disagreement. But 3 weeks ago, I received a letter. A long one. He said he wanted to make amends. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. And you believed this reconciliation was sincere? I didn't know, she said simply. But I came. I arrived yesterday afternoon. And did he greet you as a fatherly uncle, or as a collector facing regret? She hesitated. He seemed nervous, as if he didn't expect me to accept the invitation. Poirot folded his arms. And what of the others? Did they greet you warmly? Adriana's eyes flicked toward Solange and Lady Helena. No, they didn't. A quiet settled over the room like a layer of dust no one wanted to brush away. Poirot walked slowly to the decanter near the sideboard. It stood untouched beside the empty goblet. He inspected it, but did not lift it. Now, he said softly, I will ask one more question of each of you. He turned first to Helena. Madam, where were you between 10 and 11 last night? I was in the garden salon, she replied smoothly. Reading, alone. Poirot turned to Langford. I had gone to my room. I wasn't feeling well. 2. Your room on the west wing? Langford nodded. Solange. I was in the cellar, checking the backup wine stock. I returned at 10:30. Lucero? He smiled faintly. Smoking on the balcony, overlooking the lake. And you, Mademoiselle de Vries? I was unpacking in the East guest suite. Poirot offered. No reaction. But Leclerc had taken down each statement, his brow furrowed. Poirot meanwhile stepped once more to the center of the room and regarded the velvet-draped body that lay beneath the linen. A collector, he murmured, surrounded by priceless objects, killed not for what he had, but for what he knew, or perhaps for what he threatened to give away. He turned to the others. This room, it is filled with dead things, but it is the living who interest me. His voice dropped, quiet, but firm. One of you is lying, and before we dine tonight I shall know who. A flicker passed across more than one face. Poirot's little grey cells were stirring. The dance had begun. The silence that followed Poirot's pronouncement settled like a fresh layer of frost across the room. No one dared speak. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked. A bird called faintly beyond the window, its sound too, free for a place so charged with unspoken tension. Poirot adjusted the crease of his cuff and turned to Leclerc. We must begin, mon ami, with the simplest truths. The time, the sequence, the impressions. Leclerc cleared his throat, slightly, flushed from being addressed in front of the guests. Yes, of course. The maid found the body at 7:20 this morning. She said the library door was closed but not locked. The lights were off. She came into dust and... He gestured faintly toward the linen-draped form. Found him like that. I arrived 40 minutes later. The doctor arrived just after 8 and confirmed death occurred sometime between 10 and midnight, most likely closer to 10:30, based on rigor. Poirot nodded slowly. And the wine glass? Was it moved? Leclerc shook his head. Not, to our knowledge. We have preserved everything as it was. Poirot turned his gaze back to the guests, his voice soft but penetrating. Then it is now the matter of precision. You see, when one lies, it is the details that unravel. The truth is consistent. Lies fray. He turned slightly to face Solange, who sat once again with her notebook clutched in one hand like a talisman. "Mademoiselle, you said you were in the cellar last night. May I ask why?" Solange lifted her chin. "Because the inventory required updating. I checked the temperature control and the labels every 3 days. Last night was one of those days." "Indeed. And no one accompanied you?" "No." "Did anyone see you descend?" She hesitated. "No. I told Monsieur de Vries I would go down after dinner. He agreed." Poirot stepped away. "Forgive me, I am a man of habit. When I walk through a house, I notice such things. The cellar door. It creaks, yes? Quite badly?" Solange did not answer immediately. "Yes," Leclerc confirmed, frowning, loudly. "Then perhaps," Poirot said mildly, "someone would have heard it." "No?" Lucero chimed in with a lazy shrug. "I did, but I thought she was coming back upstairs, not going down." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Curious. And did you hear her return?" Lucero blinked. "No, but I was on the balcony." "And you, Lady Helena? Did you hear footsteps or the cellar door?" Lady Helena pressed a hand to her chest. "I did hear the door, I think. A faint creak. But I wasn't timing anyone's movements." "Ah, but the ear catches things even the eyes miss," Poirot said with a faint smile. He turned then to Adriana. She had not moved since her earlier statement, and her stillness now was not the stillness of control, but something more interior, something reluctant. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "you said you were unpacking. Did anyone see you?" "No." "You were in the East Suite?" "Yes." Poirot turned to Leclerc. "This room, it does not have a lock on the inside, but it is the only guest room with a view of the rear gardens." "No." Leclerc nodded. "That's right. Why?" Poirot gave a small shrug. "Observation only. One sees the approach to the library windows from there." Adriana looked up, surprised. "You did not happen to glance out last night?" "No," she said quietly but firmly. "I was thinking of your uncle." She didn't answer. Poirot pivoted with an almost theatrical grace toward Edward Langford, who had been twitching slightly with the desire not to be spoken to. "Monsieur Langford, the room in which you stayed, it is above the west wing." Langford nodded. "Yes." "And you said you felt unwell. Did you call for assistance?" "No. I just went to bed." "Strange, is it not, how illness can come upon one precisely when a man dies?" Langford flinched slightly. I was just tired. I had a headache." Poirot studied him for a moment longer, then stepped back and crossed his arms. "So we have 5 people, none with a proper alibi, all within reach of the poisoned goblet. And yet, none of you saw the fatal moment." His eyes drifted to the tall cabinet behind the desk, polished walnut with brass inlay. Its door was ajar. Poirot moved to it and opened it carefully. Inside were several crystal goblets, identical to the one on the floor. "Ah," he said softly. "A collection even of glasses. A man who prefers uniformity even in his drinkware." Solange cleared her throat. "He insisted every guest use a different glass. It was a small affectation." Poirot turned. "And who chose his glass last?" "Night?" She hesitated. "He did. He always did." Poirot's voice lowered. "And was the wine already poured when the others entered?" "No," she admitted. "He poured it himself from the bottle I opened." "A man confident in his control," Poirot mused. Leclerc stepped forward. "So the poison was in the bottle?" Poirot paused. "It is possible, but unlikely. Only Maximilian drank from it." Solange nodded. "Yes, no one else had the Chateau Pavie, the rest had white." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then the poison was specific to him, very specific." Lucero shifted. "But if no one touched his glass, how—" Poirot's eyes flashed. "Monsieur Lucero, I did not say no one touched it. I said he poured it, but someone could have prepared it beforehand." He turned back to the guests. "There was, I think, an opportunity. A moment after dinner. Solange was in the cellar. Langford claims to be in his room. The rest were alone, each one conveniently unobserved." His voice took on a sharper edge. But someone entered this room, someone who knew he would take that specific glass, someone who poisoned it in advance, perhaps while pretending to admire. The collection. The weight of his words settled over them. "And now I will do what I do best," Poirot said softly. "I will wait. Not idly, oh no, never idly. I will watch. The murderer. They are not calm. Not really. They will slip. And I, Hercule Poirot, will be watching." Without waiting for a response, he turned to Leclerc and whispered something inaudible. Then, with a faint nod to the rest, he walked slowly toward the door. Adriana's voice broke the silence. "Do you really think one of us did it?" Poirot paused, hand on the doorframe. "I think," he said, "that in every room full of secrets the shadows do not merely fall. They cling." And with that he departed, leaving 5 suspects behind in a room where silence no longer felt safe. The corridor outside the library was narrow, lined with dim sconces and painted in the muted greys and olives of an era long past. Poirot walked, slowly, his gloved hands folded behind his back, his polished shoes making scarcely a sound on the patterned rug. Inspector Leclerc followed in his wake, flipping through his notebook with nervous energy. "She is lying, you know," Leclerc said under his breath. "The curator, Solange. That routine about checking labels at night? A little too neat, too prepared?" Poirot did not break stride. "Ah, perhaps, mon ami, but you are eager. Suspicion is not the same as guilt. Mademoiselle Solange, she may indeed lie, but the lie, it may serve to hide something other than murder." Leclerc frowned. "You think she's protecting someone?" Poirot glanced at him. "I think she is protecting herself from embarrassment, perhaps, or from being thought disloyal. But murder? That I do not yet know." They reached the antechamber off the main hallway. It was sparsely furnished, but a single marble bust, a Roman senator, weathered and cold-eyed, watched over the room like a silent judge. Poirot stopped beneath it. "I wish to see the cellar," he said simply. Leclerc blinked. "The wine." "Cellar?" Poirot gave a tiny nod. "Where Mademoiselle Solange claims to have spent her time last night. I am not thirsty for wine, Leclerc. I am thirsty for confirmation." They were led by a maid, one of the quiet uniformed staff who moved through the villa like ghosts, to a narrow stairwell at the back of the house. The steps were stone, worn smooth in the center, and the air grew cooler with each descent. A metal door opened onto the cellar proper. A long room of low beams and red brick arches, rows of bottle racks stretching out like a subterranean library of its own. Poirot inhaled sharply through his nose. "The air, it is clean, but tinged with cork and age. No scent of strychnine, that is well." Leclerc moved toward a clipboard hanging on a nail. "Inventory log, Solange's handwriting." Poirot glanced at it. Each line was dated with care, annotated with location markers and temperature readings. He lifted a finger and ran it gently along a dusty shelf edge. "A perfectionist, no?" he murmured. "A woman of detail, her handwriting, her work. She needs the world to align." Leclerc glanced at the racks. No broken bottles, no disturbed shelves, nothing out of order. Poirot nodded. "Precisely. But you see, order can be deceptive. Sometimes it is too perfect." He pointed to a rack labeled Chateau Pavie. "This vintage, the same as that which was served last night?" Leclerc checked the entry. "Yes, 12 bottles, one removed, marked and dated." Poirot inspected the shelf. There was a faint outline of dust where the missing bottle had stood. "And yet," he murmured, "there is no smudge, no mistake, as if her hands were never truly here last night at all." Leclerc stepped back. "So she lied?" Poirot tilted his head. "She may have meant to come down. She may have told herself she would come down. But I believe something distracted her." They exited the cellar in thoughtful silence. Back above, the villa had fallen into that tense stillness that hangs after an emotional storm. Poirot asked to be shown to the study, Maximilien de Vries' private sanctuary. Leclerc unlocked it, and they stepped inside. If the library had been a public museum of de Vries' taste, the study was its intimate twin, darker, moodier, filled with fewer pieces but more personal curation. A small desk sat beside a fireplace, and behind it, a leather-bound ledger lay open. Poirot moved directly to it. Inside were pages filled with private acquisition notes, personal observations, and, curiously, sealed envelopes tucked into a leather pouch affixed to the inner cover. Poirot extracted one and read the label aloud. "To be opened in the event of my death." He looked at Leclerc. The inspector gave a short nod. Poirot carefully unfolded the letter. It was handwritten in an elegant but slightly shaky script. Perhaps recent. His eyes scanned the contents, and his expression changed not with shock but with quiet satisfaction. He did not speak the contents aloud, but slipped the letter into his pocket. He turned to the fireplace. The ashes there were still dark, and with a poker Poirot stirred them gently. A few blackened scraps emerged. One looked like the corner of a photograph, another a shredded envelope. He bent low, retrieved them with tweezers from the desk drawer. "Someone burned something," Leclerc said, leaning in. "Oui, and not long before the murder, I would wager. Look here, this ink is not fully charred. See this?" He held up the edge of what had once been an envelope. "The seal, it is de Vries's, but this is not his handwriting." "Someone sent him something?" Poirot straightened. "Yes, and it alarmed him. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, light, uncertain, at the doorway. It was Adriana. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to ask something." Poirot turned to her, gesturing for her to enter. "Please, mademoiselle." She stepped inside but remained close to the door, her eyes drifting toward the desk. "I was hoping to look through some of his papers for anything that might explain why he asked me here." Poirot observed her in silence for a moment. "He told you nothing?" She shook her head. "Only that he regretted what happened with my mother, that he wanted to see me." Poirot nodded. "And did you believe him?" "I wanted to." "Were you close, as a child?" She hesitated. "Not close, but he used to send me postcards whenever he traveled. I kept them all, and then one day they stopped." Poirot studied her carefully. "He was a man of possession, mademoiselle. When he gave something, affection, attention, he expected it to remain his. Perhaps your mother challenged that." "She did," Adriana said bitterly. "She accused him of stealing from her, something to do with an inheritance." "Did he?" "I don't know." Poirot nodded, again slowly. "He was not a man who parted easily with anything." She looked away, her arms crossed tightly. "You think someone here killed him for something he wouldn't give up?" Poirot stepped closer. "I think he was on the verge of giving something away. Something the killer couldn't afford to let go." Adriana's brow furrowed. "You mean, like an object?" "No," Poirot said softly. "I mean a truth." Her expression shifted, somewhere between comprehension and fear. Poirot offered her a gentle smile. "Do not concern yourself, mademoiselle. The truth, she is often patient, but never silent." She nodded faintly and left the room. Leclerc, still by the fireplace, exhaled slowly. "That girl, she's hiding something too." Poirot turned toward the window. The lake was still and grey beneath a veiled sun. His reflection in the glass seemed to shimmer against the distant ripples. "They all are," he said. "Each one of them is holding something just out of sight. But the pattern, Leclerc, it begins to form. It is like a mosaic. One must stand back to see the whole." He tapped the sealed envelope in his pocket, then glanced toward the door. "And I think," he added almost to himself, "that it is time to disturb the calm." Without elaborating, he turned on his heel and left the room, his steps quickening now, as if the tempo of the puzzle had shifted. A whisper had begun to echo in the recesses of his mind, something half-formed, like the edge of a memory not quite ready to declare itself. The killer had touched something, perhaps only briefly, perhaps without thinking, but enough. Poirot would find it, not with magnifying glasses, not with fingerprints, but with the quiet, relentless certainty of his little grey cells. The sun had begun to dip behind the hills beyond Lake Geneva, casting the villa in the gold and silver light of late afternoon. Shadows stretched long along the parquet floors, and the air inside the collector's shadow grew heavier, as if the very walls held their breath. Poirot moved deliberately through the halls now, no longer meandering. The time for quiet observation had passed. The pieces were aligning, not yet the full picture, none, but enough of the edges had formed to reveal that something precious and perhaps damning lay hidden in plain sight. He entered the drawing room, where the guests had now gathered again, more by habit than by invitation. Leclerc stood discreetly at the corner, speaking quietly to a gendarme stationed at the door, while Solange sat perched stiffly on a narrow settee, her arms folded like one of the statues she so carefully catalogued. Lady Helena leaned against the mantel, swirling the remains of a glass of white wine, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp beneath their lazy lids. Lucero lounged on a velvet chair with an air of practiced disinterest, while Adriana stood by, the window arms crossed, half watching the lake and half turned away from it. Langford was conspicuously absent. Poirot entered without preamble. "I have requested that dinner be delayed," he said mildly, "for I believe that before we break bread again we must first break silence." The room responded with a subtle shift in temperature. Stiffened backs, adjusted collars, the quick dart of a glance from Lucero to Helena, Helena to Adriana. "There is no evidence," Lucero said, the first to challenge. "You're guessing." "Inspector," Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Monsieur Lucero, but you mistake me for someone who seeks evidence in the traditional sense. I am not a man of fingerprints or fibers. I deal rather in inconsistencies. And they, how shall I say, have begun to dance before my eyes." He turned then to Lady Helena. "You said last night you read in the garden salon, alone." She nodded with a languid sip. "That's correct." Poirot's brow lifted. "Curious, for the maid who clears that room in the mornings says she found no book, no cigarette tray either, and yet you are a smoker, no?" Helena's expression tightened just slightly. "I may have stepped outside briefly. Is that so unusual?" "Not at all," Poirot said. "But you see, the French doors were found unlocked this morning. De Vries was particular about locking every door at night. One would assume he did so after you entered the salon, unless, of course, you entered after he died." The words hovered, and for a moment no one breathed. Helena placed her glass down carefully. "You're accusing me of what exactly? Going for a stroll?" Poirot shook his head. "I am accusing no one. I am merely observing that the timeline—" She wobbles. "And when the timeline wobbles, it is usually because someone has their finger on the clock." Solange, who had been silently fuming, now spoke with clipped precision. "And what of Langford? He's not here." "No," Poirot agreed, "which is precisely why I must speak to him next." He turned to Leclerc and nodded once. Within moments, a young officer had been dispatched. Poirot returned his attention to the group. "I have one more observation. The bottle of wine that was served last night. The Chateau Pavie was chosen specifically by Monsieur de Vries. Solange confirmed that it was opened and served in his presence, but the bottle, when examined, shows signs of having been opened earlier, just slightly. Enough to slip in a needle. The cork does not sit flush." Solange's face blanched. "Impossible, I opened it myself. I checked the seal." "Are you certain?" Poirot asked gently. "Or did you see what you expected to see?" She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. At that moment the door opened and Edward Langford stepped in, looking pale and slightly dishevelled, a sheen of sweat across his brow. Poirot turned slowly. "Ah, Monsieur Langford, how good of you to join us." Langford's voice was faint. "I wasn't aware we were required. Let us say it is an opportunity to clear away shadows. I wonder, monsieur, why you claim to have gone to your room so early last night." "I wasn't feeling well," Langford replied, glancing around nervously. "I already said that." "Indeed, but the housekeeper says your lamp was still on well past 11, and your suitcase was found this morning half-packed." Langford looked startled. What of it?" Poirot took a step closer, his voice dropping to something softer, sharper. "You were planning to leave." Langford swallowed. "It was a precaution. After the body was found, non, monsieur. The case was disturbed before the death was known. You were planning to leave before the murder was discovered." Langford stammered, his hand trembling. "That's ridiculous. I had no reason." "No," Poirot said quietly. Even though Maximilian de Vries had recently informed you he had doubts about the authenticity of the Phoenician tablets, that he suspected you had passed off a forgery. Langford's mouth opened, then snapped shut. "Ah," Poirot said with a trace of sympathy. "You see, I have read the letter he wrote to his solicitor. It was not only about his niece. He planned to revise his will and pursue legal action against the person who had deceived him. You, Monsieur Langford." Langford collapsed into the nearest chair, his hands in his lap. "He told me he wouldn't make it public. He said he'd give me time." Poirot's voice remained calm. "And yet you feared what would happen when the truth came out." Langford looked up, defiant now. "I didn't kill him." "Perhaps not," Poirot conceded. "But you had a motive, and you lied about your whereabouts. That makes you suspect." Langford looked down again, defeated. Poirot glanced at the others. Each of you had something to lose or something to gain, but only one among you had both and the opportunity. He began to pace slowly. There was something de Vries said in passing, to Adriana, that he wanted to make amends. He invited her here to repair a wound. And there is evidence, yes, proof, that he intended to change his will to leave a significant portion of his estate to her. Adriana's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Poirot turned to Helena. "That would have altered everything, would it not, Lady Helena? Especially for someone who believed herself already promised a place in his legacy." Helena's jaw tightened. "I never asked for anything." "No," Poirot said, voice soft as silk, "but you expected it. And when he decided to bestow it, to elsewhere, you're wrong." "Am I?" Poirot studied her. "I believe you confronted him last night. I believe he told you what he planned, and I believe you knew where he kept his personal wine stash, his favored glass. You had the access, the knowledge, the resentment." Lady Helena stood motionless, her hands curled at her sides. "You didn't intend to kill him, not at first," Poirot continued. "Perhaps you only meant to frighten him, but strychnine, it leaves no room for reconsideration. The room held its breath." Then she laughed, short, bitter, a sound without humor. "You think I would poison him over a change of heart?" she asked coldly. "He broke hearts for sport. Mine, Solange's, perhaps even Adriana's. That man didn't know how to give, only how to take." Poirot tilted his head. "And when someone finally took from him, it was more than he could survive." Lady Helena's gaze held his for a long moment. Then she sank slowly into the chair beside Langford, her face unreadable. "I didn't poison him," she said softly. Poirot gave a small, grave nod. "Perhaps not, but I believe you know who did." And with that, silence fell again, heavier than before. Outside, the last light vanished behind the lake. The shadows lengthened in earnest. And the heart of the mystery, its bitter, glittering core, lay one step closer to being revealed. A clock struck 6 somewhere deep within the villa, each chime precise, hollow, and slow. Poirot did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, observing how it wrapped around the room like a tightening ribbon. No one dared move. The atmosphere was no longer merely tense. It was brittle, as if one more accusation would shatter the very air. Lady Helena remained in her seat, beside Langford, her arms now folded in a posture not of resistance but of resignation. Langford stared at the floor, hands loosely clasped. Solange still sat upright on the settee, though her eyes flickered now with something less rigid. Uncertainty, perhaps, or dread. Lucero had shifted forward slightly, one ankle crossed over his knee, as if attempting to regain control of the narrative with posture alone. Adriana remained by the window, half in shadow, her profile reflecting the amber dusk now melting across the lake. Poirot moved toward the fireplace with deliberate slowness and stood before it, his back to the flames, his hands resting on the lapels of his suit. He regarded each of them carefully, his expression unreadable. "There is one thing I must tell you," he began softly, "and it is this. Murder does not exist in a vacuum. It is not an isolated act. It is a crescendo, yes, the climax of a longer, often silent composition." He turned his gaze toward Solange. "For instance, mademoiselle, you say you were in the cellar. Yet you made no entry in the inventory log. That is unlike you. You pride yourself on precision. Did something interrupt you? Solange's lips parted, but no sound emerged. At last, she nodded. Yes, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I heard voices upstairs, raised voices. I was ashamed to be listening. Poirot tilted his head. Raised voices? Between whom? A pause. Maximilian and Lady Helena, she said. All heads turned. Helena exhaled sharply, but did not deny. Yes, she said, her tone dry. He told me he was leaving a portion of the collection to Adriana, and that I should stop assuming I was part of the furniture. And how did you respond? Poirot asked gently. I threw a vase. Poirot's eyes lit. Ah, a detail you had neglected before. Which vase? Helena's mouth twitched. One of the Ming reproductions, not an original. Poirot gave a small nod. Still, destruction of property, unlike you. But emotional disorder can provoke strange behaviors. Helena shrugged. He knew how to wound. Poirot glanced at Leclerc, who had silently re-entered during the exchange. You see, mon ami, how useful it is to dig beneath the first statements. Truth comes not all at once, but in layers. Then Poirot turned his attention slowly toward Thomas Lucero. You, monsieur, he said, have been very quiet. Too quiet, I think, for a man so accustomed to speaking his way through difficult circumstances. Lucero raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I looked into your arrival, Poirot continued. You claim De Vries invited you to appraise certain gems, but no record of any recent acquisitions appears in his personal logbook, nor in the sealed letters to his solicitor. Lucero gave a faint smile. Maybe it was a private matter. Maybe he wanted discretion. Perhaps, or perhaps you were. Not here to examine a gem, but to reclaim one. That got a reaction. Lucero stiffened. Poirot's voice was still calm, but his words moved with precision now, like chess pieces locking into position. Years ago, in Buenos Aires, a sapphire went missing. One known as the Knight's Eye, a rare piece traced back to the Samanid hordes. A collector of great reputation purchased it, believing it to be legitimate. That collector was, of course, Maximilian de Vries. But it was never seen again. Vanished. From public record. I know nothing about that, Lucero said quickly. Don't you, Poirot said, because I think you do. I think de Vries discovered it was a stolen piece, and I think he knew who had planted it in the trade circuit. You. Lucero's mouth opened, closed. He had no proof. Yet he invited you here, Poirot said. Why? Lucero hesitated. He said he wanted to make a deal. There it is, Poirot said softly. And yet no such deal is recorded. I believe that is because it never happened. I believe he changed his mind. Perhaps he told you as much. Perhaps you realized you would leave here with your name tarnished. And perhaps you saw another solution. That's... Lucero stopped himself. Everyone was watching him now. I didn't kill him, he said after a pause, more controlled. For you're building stories from ashes. Ah, Poirot replied gently. But ashes, remember. He turned toward Adriana now. Her eyes met his steadily. You have been quiet, mademoiselle, he said, but I believe there is something you have not yet said. She stepped forward slightly. I didn't think it mattered. Poirot's tone was calm. Everything matters. She glanced once at the others, then back at him. Last night, after dinner, my uncle asked me to meet him in his study. He said he had something to show me, a letter from his lawyer. He said he was going to change the will, that he wanted me to carry on the collection, to turn it into something more open, Poirot nodded. And did he show you this letter? No. He said he'd locked it away. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Locked it where? In the desk drawer. He kept the key on his watch chain. Leclerc stiffened. Poirot turned to him. You found the watch? Leclerc nodded. Yes, broken. The chain was snapped, but no key. Poirot looked around the room. So the key to the drawer containing the revised will, is missing. How curious. He stepped toward the fireplace once more and looked down at the remains he had found there earlier, the blackened edges of a document, and something more. He now pulled from his pocket a sliver of twisted brass. "The remains of a small key," he said, "recovered from the ashes." Everyone in the room stared. "He tried to burn the letter?" Adriana asked faintly. Poirot turned his eyes on her. "No, mademoiselle, he did not. Someone else did. Someone who had access to the study after he died. Someone who searched his body, found the key, unlocked the drawer, read the letter, and knew they had to erase it." He swept his gaze across the group. "The question is, who?" But before anyone could speak, Leclerc took a step forward. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice tight, "there's something else. One of the maids came forward. She saw someone enter the study after midnight. She thought it odd because the lights were already out." Poirot did not react. "And who did she see?" Leclerc looked grim. "Langford." All heads turned. Langford looked up, startled. "What? That's not true." Poirot's eyes were cold now, the gentleness gone. "You were seen, monsieur. And the suitcase in your room. It contained not only your clothes but several wrapped items, including an ancient coin set matching one recently removed from De Vries's locked display." Langford paled. "I didn't poison him," he whispered. "I didn't. He was dead when I got there. I swear it. I only—" "You only what?" Poirot pressed. "I panicked," Langford said, voice cracking. "I thought if I took something, at least it wouldn't all go to waste. I thought he'd betrayed me. And then, when I saw the body, I couldn't think. I went to the study, I found the key on the chain, and I read the letter. When I realized what it meant, I destroyed." "To silence." Poirot nodded. "So you are guilty, yes, but not of murder. Theft, deception, cowardice, but not the act itself." Langford looked sick. "Then who?" Poirot turned slowly, his voice soft again. "That," he said, "is what I shall reveal tomorrow morning." He folded his hands. "Now we let the night pass, and the guilty they will not sleep well." And with that, he exited, leaving them, once more, to their shadows. Morning came slowly to the villa, drifting in through the long windows in a haze of pearl-grey light. The lake beyond was quiet, blank and unreadable, and inside the collector's shadow there was no conversation, no laughter over breakfast, no routine footsteps echoing across the parquet floors. Only silence, taut and waiting. Poirot was already seated in the grand salon by the time the guests were summoned. The room had been rearranged ever so slightly, chairs drawn into a semicircle, no table to separate, no glass to distract. Leclerc stood near the doorway, arms folded, his face unreadable but alert. An officer hovered in the background, unobtrusive but present. The 5 remaining guests entered slowly, warily, each finding their seat with a stiffness that betrayed a sleepless night. Solange's hair was pinned tighter than usual. Helena's scarf was perfectly knotted but her lipstick faint. Langford looked washed out, his hands trembling slightly. Lucero walked in with his usual swagger, but it was frayed at the edges now. Adriana came last, her posture composed but her eyes shadowed. Poirot rose and bowed politely. "Mesdames, messieurs, thank you for your punctuality. I asked you to gather this morning so that I may relieve you of the burden that has hung over this house since Maximilien de Vries was murdered." The words spoken so plainly had the desired effect. There was a subtle shift. Shoulders tensed, glances exchanged. Poirot allowed the moment to settle before continuing. "Over the past 2 days I have listened, I have observed. I have noted the contradictions, the omissions, the too precise answers and the too vague ones, and I have come to a conclusion. Not one based on physical evidence, no, for such things are prone to manipulation, but on psychology, on motive, and on behavior." He walked slowly before them now, hands clasped lightly behind his back. "We begin with what we know. Monsieur de Vries died of strychnine poisoning, delivered via a glass of Chateau Pavie wine, poured by his own hand from a bottle selected by him. A bottle, it seems, that had been tampered with in advance. The cork was reseated. This required time, foresight, and more importantly, knowledge. Knowledge of his habits, his favorite vintage, his ritual of choosing that exact bottle. He stopped before Solange. "You, mademoiselle, had access to the wine cellar. You knew every bottle. You say you opened the wine in his presence and poured, but in fact you only opened the bottle. He poured for himself, that is crucial. You did not pour the poison, no, but you could have prepared the bottle earlier. Solange met his eyes without flinching. If I had wanted to kill him, I would not have used such a method. It's messy, loud. Strychnine is violent. Just so, Poirot said gently. You prefer order, precision. You may have disliked him, but you did not kill him. He moved to Langford. Monsieur, your guilt lies elsewhere. Theft, cowardice, the destruction of a letter that could have redeemed a name, but not the murder. You panicked. You are not a killer. Langford exhaled audibly, head bowed. Poirot turned next to Lady Helena. You, madame, had cause. He wounded your pride, your expectations, and your heart. But in your anger you threw a vase. You acted impulsively. The poison, no, that requires planning, calculation. Your violence is loud, not hidden. Helena arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Poirot turned to Lucero. And you, monsieur, a thief, yes, a deceiver without question. But I believe your game is survival. You play with shadows, but you do not kill for legacy. You kill for necessity, and in this case, you were too exposed. Too late. Lucero smirked faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then Poirot turned to Adriana. He paused, then walked to the center of the room and faced her directly. Mademoiselle, he said quietly, I must speak to you last. She sat still, saying nothing. You came here at your uncle's invitation, after decades of estrangement. You were offered reconciliation, perhaps redemption, but what he offered was not love, it was control. He summoned you not to give you anything, but to demand your return on his terms. Adriana's hands tightened in her lap. You say he spoke of changing his will, of passing the legacy to you. But there is something you did not say, something I believe only became clear to you when you arrived. Poirot's voice dropped to a murmur. You were not the only one he contacted. Adriana looked up sharply. He wrote to your mother, the original heir. He sought to bring her back, not you, but she refused, and so he settled for the second best, a niece instead of a sister. You were not the heir by affection, you were the heir by default. Adriana's eyes widened. How do you know that? Because I found a second letter, hidden in the back of his solicitor's ledger, a reply, returned unopened, marked refused. No further contact. It was addressed to your mother, dated a week before yours. The room was still. Poirot continued softly. And I believe that when you arrived here, full of hope, only to realize that he was using you again, you snapped. You remembered the childhood wounds, the betrayal, the man who cast your mother aside and treated you as an afterthought. And you knew one thing with absolute clarity, that nothing he gave would be without a price, that if he changed his will, it was not a gift, it was a leash. Adriana stood abruptly. That's not true. Poirot's voice was calm. You had the knowledge, you had the motive, you had access to the cellar the day before. I believe you slipped in when Solange was away. I believe you watched your uncle's routine and prepared the bottle, knowing he would select it. I didn't. Poirot raised a hand. You killed him, mademoiselle, not out of greed, not even out of revenge, but to free yourself, to break the last thread tying you to a man who never truly loved you, who kept you dangling like one of his treasures, catalogued but never cherished. Adriana was trembling now. No, she whispered. Poirot stepped closer. But then, guilt. It arrived quickly, no? You didn't mean to become a murderer. You only wanted escape, but strychnine, it makes escape impossible. It forces you to witness your crime. You saw him die in agony, and afterward, you said nothing, because it was too late. She stared at him, tears forming but not falling. Her voice cracked. He ruined my mother, he let her suffer, he hoarded everything, even kindness. Poirot said nothing. I wanted him to feel powerless, she whispered. Just once, just for once. The room was silent. Poirot gave a small nod, and so he did. Leclerc stepped forward. Adriana didn't resist as she was quietly taken. Aside, nor did she speak again. The others watched in stunned quiet. Poirot remained still for a moment longer, then turned to the rest of them. It is finished, he said. Not neatly, not happily, but truthfully. He looked once more out, toward the lake. Murder, he murmured, is rarely about hatred. More often it is about silence, the silence one can no longer bear. And then, with the air of a man who had merely tidied a disorderly room, Hercule Poirot adjusted his cuffs, straightened his tie, and walked out into the soft morning light. Poirot's steps were quiet as he moved down the corridor toward the study once more, but his mind, ever alert, remained in motion. Though the matter had by all appearances concluded, the confession drawn, the motive laid bare, the killer identified, there was one thread still unresolved, coiled in the back of his mind like a ribbon left unknotted. Adriana's final words, echoed with too much clarity. I wanted him to feel powerless. It had been said in the tone of someone who believed it deeply, not as justification, but as explanation. And yet, despite the emotional resonance, Poirot felt it, the smallest friction of something unsaid. Not falsehood, no, but omission, the kind of omission born not from guilt but from protection, a shadow behind the truth. He entered the study and closed the door behind him. The morning light spread softly across the floorboards, illuminating the objects on Maximilien de Vries's desk, a brass magnifying glass, a letter opener shaped like a dagger, a half-filled ink well. He returned to the drawer where the revised will had once been hidden. The key, destroyed in the fireplace, had rendered its contents lost until Langford's late-night theft. But there had been more inside than Langford admitted. Poirot was certain of it. He knelt and carefully examined the drawer once more. This time he removed it entirely, lifting the compartment out of the desk. Beneath it, barely visible in the shadows, lay a second false bottom. Thin, cleverly designed. He pressed the side with his index finger. It gave slightly, then released. Inside was a narrow velvet envelope. Poirot drew it out with great care and unfolded it on the desk. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, old, faded, but unmistakably of a younger Maximilien de Vries, with a woman and a child on a beach, a handwritten letter, unsigned, but unmistakably penned by Maximilien's hand, and, most curious of all, a folded page from a Sotheby's catalogue, marked with a red X, across a page featuring an ancient Mesopotamian seal. Poirot read the letter slowly. It was addressed not to Adriana, but to her mother. I wronged you, and for that I can offer no defense. I kept what was yours and told myself I was preserving history. I was preserving myself. But you were right. That seal never belonged in my collection. It belonged in your father's. You trusted me. I betrayed that trust. It's time to return. I have instructed my solicitor to prepare the transfer. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wish to clear the ledger before it closes. Poirot folded the letter slowly. He sat back in the chair, considering. The seal. So it was not only inheritance that de Vries had sought to rewrite in his final days. It was restitution. Something he had stolen long ago. Something hidden within his vast and tangled collection. The Mesopotamian seal had not been mentioned by anyone. No guest had spoken of it. No documentation had flagged it. Yet he had marked it, meant to return. Then someone else had learned of this intention. The door opened behind him. It was Leclerc. Everything is prepared, he said. Adriana has been taken into custody. She hasn't said a word since. Poirot turned in his chair. She will not speak. Not because she is proud, but because she is afraid. Leclerc frowned. Afraid? Poirot tapped the envelope. Tell me, my friend, do you believe the motive she gave? That she killed her uncle for independence? Leclerc crossed his arms. It fits, emotionally at least. Yes, Poirot said softly, but not precisely. She is not impulsive, and strychnine, as you observed yourself, is a cruel method. It is not for the faint-hearted. Leclerc studied him. Then you think what? Poirot stood and paced to the window. She did not poison the wine, he said, but she believes she did. Leclerc blinked. That's absurd. She confessed. She confessed to intention, yes, to resentment, to opportunity. But I have seen confessions of all kinds, mon ami. Not all of them are true. He turned sharply. Langford feared exposure. Helena feared erasure. Solange feared chaos. Lucero feared discovery. But Adriana, she feared becoming him. That was her burden, not the act. Leclerc's brow furrowed. Then who? Poirot walked over to the study's far cabinet, the one filled with coin sets and Assyrian fragments. He pointed to a sealed display near the bottom. Do you recall the coin set that was nearly stolen? Leclerc nodded. Langford was trying to smuggle it out. Correct. But there was something else missing. A seal. It had been catalogued but not displayed. According to Solange's inventory, it should have been in a side drawer. It was not. Leclerc narrowed his eyes. So it was taken? No, Poirot said quietly. It was never meant to be seen again. He returned to the letter and tapped the Sotheby's clipping. De Vries planned to return this object. He was trying at the end to correct something. Terrible. But someone feared what would be revealed with that return. Poirot's voice dropped. Someone who had benefited from the theft. Leclerc's eyes widened. Lucero, Poirot nodded slowly. It fits. A dealer, a middleman, someone who helped De Vries launder an artifact long ago, who feared it might resurface with documentation attached. His invitation to the villa was not chance. De Vries summoned him to make restitution, but Lucero realized the truth before anyone else, that if De Vries followed through, it would implicate him. Leclerc stepped back. So Lucero poisoned him? Yes. But not with rage, with calm calculation. He likely prepared the bottle before Adriana even arrived. He allowed the family tensions to rise, allowed Helena to argue, Langford to panic, Adriana to resent. Everyone had a reason to appear guilty, and when Adriana made her move, when she entered the study, full of hurt and confusion, Lucero saw his opportunity. He let her believe. It, Leclerc whispered. Poirot nodded gravely. And now she sits in custody, convinced she caused a death she merely wished for. Leclerc's jaw clenched. We need to bring him in. Now. Wait, Poirot said, raising a hand. Not yet. He must not suspect. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. Tell the staff to prepare a final gathering. 1 hour, the same salon. This time, we finish the game properly. Leclerc gave a short nod and disappeared down the hall. Poirot remained in the study. For a long moment after, listening to the creak of the old wood, the silence of a house that had witnessed too much. Then, with a breath that seemed to center the world again, he folded the letter, slipped it into his inner pocket, and made his way once more toward the room where every mask would fall. The end was near. But before it came, the truth deserved its moment. In full. The salon had been reset once more, chairs aligned in a tight circle beneath the chandelier's pale glow, the windows shuttered to block out the lake's indifferent shimmer. The air inside had grown thick with expectation, as if the very walls strained to hear what Hercule Poirot would say next. He entered the room with his customary precision, his grey suit pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror-like gleam, and his expression unreadable but calm. Lucero was already seated, legs crossed, the tip of his polished shoe tapping idly against the carpet. His posture was elegant, unconcerned, though his eyes were alert beneath his half-lidded gaze. The others followed shortly thereafter. Langford walked in, hunched, his shame still clinging to him like an ill-fitting coat. Helena moved with regal weariness, her posture ramrod straight despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Solange arrived last, arms crossed tightly, face unreadable, but her eyes never left Poirot's. Leclerc stood by the door as before, arms behind his back. A second officer lingered near the hall. Adriana, Poirot had requested not be present, not yet. Poirot stepped into the center of the group and bowed slightly. Merci, he said softly. You are all tired. You are all, no doubt, wondering why I summon you again when the mystery seems already resolved. Mademoiselle Adriana de Vries has been taken into custody for the poisoning of her uncle. A confession was made. Yes, a motive presented. The logic of the act, as we understand it, was one of escape. One might say of freedom. He began to walk slowly along the curve of the room. But I have learned, in all my years, that the truth She does not always wear the face we expect. Sometimes she hides behind the expected, the emotional, the human. He paused near Lucero and turned slightly. And sometimes she is replaced by something else, something convenient. Lucero looked up. You're saying the confession is false? Poirot's voice remained calm. I am saying the confession was incomplete. Solange's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Langford's hand twitched. Helena simply narrowed her eyes. Poirot moved again. You see, Adriana believed she was responsible. She wished it even if she did not act. Her guilt, though misplaced, was real. But there was something she did not know. Something that did not belong in the neat emotional picture she offered. He reached into his coat and produced the faded envelope he had found beneath the false drawer. He unfolded the contents slowly and laid them upon the table in the center of the circle, the photograph, the Sotheby's page, and the letter. This, he said quietly, is the truth Maximilien de Vries tried to bury, and, in the final days of his life, tried to exhume. A stolen seal, taken decades ago, belonging not to him but to the family of his sister, to Adriana's mother. He turned toward Helena. Madam, you were correct in your judgment. Maximilien was not a generous man. He hoarded not just objects but apologies. But this was his attempt at restitution. Poirot's eyes swept the room. But it was also a threat. Because once that seal was returned, questions would be asked, documents reviewed, sales traced, and in that long shadow, another man stood, one who helped arrange the transaction, a man who ensured it disappeared from public record, who profited from its silence. Lucero's face did not move, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. Poirot's voice remained steady. The invitation to this villa was not a whim. De Vries brought you here, Monsieur Lucero, to face a quiet reckoning. He never intended to expose you publicly, but he planned to sever the tie, to return the object, to name his crime and in doing so name yours. Lucero tilted his head slightly. That speculation, Poirot nodded. It would be, yes, if not for this. He reached into his pocket once more and retrieved a second sheet, a photocopy of a bank transaction made to a numbered account in Zurich. De Vries's solicitor confirmed this sum, transferred to you the day after he retrieved the seal. Payment, I believe, for silence, or perhaps guilt. But something changed. The day before he died, he instructed his solicitor to halt the payment. He was preparing to return the item. Poirot stepped closer, his tone still unhurried, and then he was poisoned, with strychnine, an agonizing death, a loud one, but cleverly administered, in a bottle chosen by himself, a glass poured by his own hand. Only one who knew his habits intimately could ensure that he alone would receive the dose, and only one who stood to lose everything by the truth's emergence. Had the motive to strike first. He turned now fully toward Lucero. I believe you tampered with the bottle the afternoon before, while Solange was occupied. I believe you used your time on the balcony not only to smoke but to observe. You saw Adriana's distress. You knew the fracture between her and her uncle. And when she slipped into the study that night, when she argued, perhaps even threatened him, you knew it was your chance she would think she had done it. The guilt would be hers. The truth would die with him. Lucero slowly rose to his feet, smiling faintly. You've got a good story, he said. Very poetic. But do you have proof? Poirot raised a finger. Only this, your cigarette case. Lucero froze. I had it examined this morning. It was left on the table during your first interview. Inside, the lining had absorbed traces of powdered strychnine, not consistent with casual exposure but with residue from handling. The drug was concealed there before it was transferred to the cork, a habit of many old smugglers, carrying what they do not want seen in the lining of something ordinary. Lucero's face remained still. Poirot stepped closer. I also have the maid's testimony. She saw you pass through the hallway toward the cellar at 4 o'clock the day before the murder. Not Solange, you, unnoticed at the time, overlooked. Until now. Lucero looked around the room slowly. Then with a tired breath he sat again. He was going to ruin everything, he said simply. I built my life on discretion, quiet trades, safe exchanges. Then he decides to find his conscience. You killed to preserve your image, Poirot said gently, and let an innocent woman carry the weight. Lucero shrugged, unbothered. She was halfway there already. Leclerc stepped forward now, no longer still, motioning to the officer at the door. Lucero did not resist. He stood, straightened his jacket and walked toward them with a grace that never once faltered. As he crossed the threshold, he looked back at Poirot. "You're better than they say," he murmured. Poirot inclined his head. "And you, monsieur?" "Lucero are exactly as I suspected." The door closed behind him. Silence returned. It felt lighter now, emptied of malice but not yet filled with peace. Langford broke the stillness. "What about Adriana?" Poirot turned slowly. "She will be released, but not without scars." Solange's voice was quiet. "She should not have blamed herself." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but that, mademoiselle, is often the way with those who feel deeply. They assume the worst of themselves before they dare to believe the worst of others." He walked toward the window, opened the shutters. The lake gleamed again, the morning sun now fully risen. Helena stood and approached him. "You've tied it all together," she said. "But it doesn't feel unfinished." Poirot nodded. "No, because truth, madame, is not always justice, and justice is not always peace." He looked out over the water, hands resting lightly on the sill. "But peace," he added, "is something we must choose to make ourselves, after all is said, after all is done." And with that, he turned from the window, his work complete, at least for now. The final rays of morning light stretched across the lake like strands of glass, the surface calm now, as if it too had held its breath through the ordeal, and could finally exhale. Inside the collector's shadow, the oppressive air of suspicion had lifted, though in its place hung a softer, quieter weight. The aftermath, the reckoning. Poirot stood in the entrance hall, his suitcase already beside him, his gloved hands resting lightly on the handle. Leclerc approached, the lines of worry on his face now smoothed by resolution, though his eyes still carried a shadow of unfinished thought. "She'll be released within the hour," he said. "The paperwork is being expedited. I've spoken with the magistrate." Poirot nodded. "Bon, that is good. Justice must never be delayed where innocence has suffered." They stood a moment in silence, watching the house come slowly back to life. The staff returned to their duties with cautious steps. A tray of tea was quietly set in the drawing room. Curtains drawn the previous day were gently opened again, and from the upper corridor a faint voice was heard, Adriana, speaking quietly. To the housekeeper. No tears, no outburst, just a conversation. Real, human. "She still believes," Leclerc said quietly, "that some part of it was her fault." "Perhaps," Poirot replied, "but that is not a fault of reason. It is a wound of the heart, the kind that lingers long after logic has had its say." He paused. "She will come to understand in time, perhaps not to forgive herself, but to live alongside the truth. That is all we may hope." Leclerc hesitated. "And the seal?" Poirot looked toward the study. "It will be returned, with proper documentation. The solicitor has already been informed." Leclerc nodded. "You're thorough." Poirot gave a faint smile. "One must be when the truth has been buried so long." They moved toward the front door where a black car waited, its engine purring softly in the gravel. Poirot reached for his hat and paused at the threshold. "But tell me," he said, "what will become of the collection?" Leclerc glanced back over his shoulder. "That's for the estate to sort out. Without a valid will, it reverts to the original one on record. Helena and Solange are named executors, if you can believe it." Poirot lifted an eyebrow. "Ah, that will be delicate." "You've left them with a powder keg," Leclerc said with a rueful smile. "Perhaps," Poirot replied, "but also with a lesson. That possession is not the same as purpose, and a collection is not the same as a legacy." He stepped out onto the gravel path, the morning sun warming his shoulders. As he descended the steps, he saw her. Adriana stood near the edge of the lawn, just beyond the trimmed hedges. She was staring out at the lake, a coat wrapped around her shoulders despite the sun. When she saw Poirot, she did not move at first, but then she turned and met him halfway. her expression unreadable, but her eyes clear. "You were right," she said simply. Poirot inclined his head. "Only because you were honest with yourself in the end." "I didn't know," she said. "Not really, about the seal, about Lucero. I thought he was just some charming guest, but now I keep thinking, if I had gone into the study sooner. If I had spoken to my uncle earlier." "Non," Poirot said gently. "You must not walk that path. The choices of others do not rest on your shoulders. He invited me here as a stand-in," she said quietly now. "A replacement for the person he truly wanted to forgive him." "Yes," Poirot admitted, "but he did choose to change, and in the end it was you who forced the truth into the light." Her voice caught. "I didn't want justice, I just wanted peace." Poirot looked toward the lake. "And you shall have it. Not easily, not immediately. But peace comes not as a gift, mademoiselle. It must be earned. Slowly. Through the work of healing." She nodded and looked down at her hands. "What happens now?" "You will return home," Poirot said. "You will sleep. You will feel the world move again, and one day, when you are ready, you will tell the story, not of what happened here, but of what you chose not to become." A long silence passed, between them soft and reverent. Then Adriana said, "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." He gave a small, formal bow. "It is I who thank you, for reminding me that the heart, too, has logic." He turned and walked toward the waiting car. As the driver opened the door, he took one last look back at the villa, the tall windows, the stone facade, the shadows that no longer loomed quite so heavily. Inside those walls, so much had been hidden: lies, ambition, fear. But also, quietly, stubbornly, hope. And though a life had ended and another had very nearly been destroyed, something had shifted, a cycle broken, a silence pierced. He settled into the seat as the engine purred to life. As the car pulled away, winding down the gravel drive, Poirot let his eyes close for a moment, the rhythm of the road rising and falling beneath him. Not every case ended cleanly, not every answer brought relief, but this one, this quiet affair in the shadow of a collector's legacy, had offered something rare: the unmasking of a killer, the freeing of the innocent, and the restoration of a truth long buried. Outside, the lake shimmered in the light. A breeze stirred the trees. The villa, once steeped in silence, stood again in the stillness of morning. Not haunted, not hollow, but quiet in a different way. And Poirot, the little Belgian with the meticulous moustache and the relentless mind, leaned back into the seat and let the day begin anew. The train to Lausanne hummed softly beneath the polished compartment where Hercule Poirot sat alone, the rhythmic motion of the journey swaying gently in time with his thoughts. A silver thermos of coffee rested beside him untouched. Outside the window, the landscape rolled by, green pastures dotted with cottages, the pale glint of lake water appearing between the hills, and above it all, the cloudless blue sky stretching with late summer stillness. He had removed his gloves, folded precisely beside his newspaper, and sat with hands steepled under his chin, eyes half closed in thought. But Poirot was not dozing. No, he was reviewing, as he always did after a case, not only the facts and the solution, but the people, the moments, the shadows between truth and motive. There had been so many shadows in this case. He had thought, when the summons came to Lake Geneva, that it would be a matter of vanity, perhaps a theft or a forgery among collectors. Maximilien de Vries had a reputation for theatrical excess, but was, in Poirot's opinion, a man driven by control rather than malevolence. And yet, it was that very desire to control, to curate not only his treasures but his legacy, that had brought about his undoing. Poirot considered Adriana once more. Her face, so closed at first, then cracking with grief and confusion, remained vivid in his mind. She had not killed her uncle, but she had believed herself capable of it, and that belief had almost destroyed her. He thought, too, of Lucero, whose mask had slipped only in the final moment, when all possible denials had collapsed beneath the weight of logic. A man too clever by half, too confident in the noise of other people's guilt. He had orchestrated the perfect illusion, a murder without fingerprints, without witnesses, and a scapegoat already halfway to believing in her own darkness, and yet Poirot had seen the flaw. The one thread in the weave that did not belong. It had always come down to the psychology, as it so often did. Lucero, in his haste to frame another, had overestimated his subtlety. A single unaccounted hour, a misplaced visit to the cellar, the residue in his own cigarette case, all small things. But the little grey cells, they had not missed them. Poirot allowed himself the smallest smile. What fascinated him most, however, was not the crime itself, but its intent. Lucero had not killed for rage or passion. He had killed for preservation, to keep his past hidden, to silence a truth that, if uncovered, might not even have ruined him in a court of law, but would have robbed him of power, of position. That, Poirot knew, was the most dangerous motive of all. Not love, not jealousy, not greed, but the fear of exposure. The door to his compartment slid open with a polite knock. A steward entered, nodding respectfully. "Monsieur Poirot? Telegram just arrived at the last station." Poirot accepted it with a gracious thank you and opened the crisp envelope. His eyes moved across the words Adriana released. "Returns to Geneva tonight. She asked to convey thanks. Solicitor confirms seal returned to rightful hands. Will revised per original instructions. Lucero confesses under pressure. Case officially closed." Leclerc Poirot folded the message and slipped it into his coat pocket. So it was finished. Justice had been served, if not in the courtroom, then in the hearts of those most affected. The seal, long buried in the vault of guilt, had found its rightful place. And Adriana, perhaps she too would find her place again, not in her uncle's shadow, but in the light of a truth reclaimed. The steward returned, this time with coffee freshened and a warm croissant wrapped in a linen cloth. Poirot thanked him, then turned back to the window, finally allowing himself a sip of the drink. The train curved gently through a bend, revealing a wide stretch of water beneath the sun. Somewhere across that lake stood the collector's shadow, no longer silent, no longer cloaked in misdirection, but simply a house, a place where one man's attempt at control had ended in chaos, and where others had learned the high cost of secrets, even the ones they told themselves. Poirot exhaled slowly. It was a curious thing, this business of murder. So often it was not about death, but about what came before it. The pain unspoken, the betrayal unhealed, the truth resisted until it exploded. He folded his hands once more. "Murder," he murmured to no one, "is not the final act. It is only the climax. The real story is always written in the motives." The train continued its quiet course toward the city, and Poirot, eyes closing at last, allowed himself the rarest indulgence, a moment of peace.